Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Well, today we're going to be touching on mental health, and it is a huge and growing problem, and the last 2 years of the pandemic have only added to those issues. Depression and anxiety are things that have been affecting an increasing number of the population. I mean, young and old. I've heard some estimates that 1 in 5 children under the age of 20 have been diagnosed with anxiety or depression. I think that figure is higher as we grow older. And it's an alarming figure. I think the other thing that has come out of this pandemic, I was reading an article recently from the American Psychology Society's review of the impact of social isolation, and found that it had the equivalent health effect of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So, as though mental health wasn't a big problem before this pandemic, it's become an even bigger problem. And so looking at solutions other than that is often offered via the prescription pad is something that we feel pretty passionate about on this podcast. And so that is the subject of today's podcast. My guest is Natalie West. Now, Natalie is a clinical psychotherapist with over 16 years of experience. She specialises in self-image conflict and nutritional psychology for treating mental and physical root cause health problems. Natalie provides a proven long-term strategy to help her clients to supercharge their mental and metabolic health, very closely related as we discussed today. Natalie's focus on nutrition has been challenging the current delivery methods of treating mental and physical health, which if the profits of pharmaceutical companies are anything to go by, it is often a prescription medication to deal with chronic disease. And mental health is no exception there. The number of people on antidepressants is quite surprising. With qualifications in clinical behavioral science, applied clinical hypnotherapy, and nutritional psychology, and she is also currently completing a qualification in nutritional psychiatry. Look, this dovetails into so many other episodes that we have had, but brings together the power of nutrition in mental health. And we particularly focus on the carnivore diet, which Natalie is a great proponent of personally and professionally. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Natalie West. Welcome to the show, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Ron. Glad to be here.
Natalie, your background is obviously psychology, but you have an interest that goes way beyond the talking therapies, and we're going to be discussing that. I know you're very focused on self-image, and I think that's something we all need to engage with, obviously. But I'm just interested to know your own journey that's brought you to this point in your professional career.
Yeah, absolutely. So many moons ago, I started working at the age of 17, and I had a 20-year corporate career. So I was in operational management and sales for many, many years. And I was always very fascinated by the sales process and why people said yes and why people said no. And, from my point of view, it was like, what was going on in their brain that made them take on the deal or not? So human behavior I've always been really interested in. And then after my first child at 33, I realized that, I wanted a career change. And I started down the road of doing the normal psychology model for about a year. And then something just didn't align with me in relation to understanding. Also, I have a bodybuilding background about how powerful food is and what we need both mentally and physically. So sitting through, I guess, the psychology model, it just didn't meld with me. So I stepped back from that. And then I ended up going to a seminar where I actually met a gentleman who was an orthomolecular specialist and also a psychotherapist. And I was like, wow, How does my mind
Mhm.
work? How does my gut and my mind work together? And I was just hooked from that point in time. So
Mm.
16 years later, Ron, here I am,
Mhm.
done all different types of training in relation to, deep state clinical hypnosis, performance training, psychotherapy, and all different models. So Jung therapy, Erickson techniques, and also nutritional psychology, because I think we're so disconnected from, psychology is generally, we talk to this part of our head, right? But I always say we have two brains, and our
Mm.
first brain is our gut. And if we don't understand that, the signaling and the messaging just doesn't get through to the brain for it to work properly.
Mm. You mentioned orthomolecular and psychiatry, and we've actually I'm very privileged to be on the Orthomolecular News Service editorial
Yeah.
board, and I've spoken to many of those wonderful people on that board. It's a whole area of using supplements and diet to improve general health. Do you
Correct.
remember who was that? The
So that was,
orthomolecular psychiatrist.
Pfeiffer and Hoffer that started back, many, many moons
Mm-hmm.
ago. Dr. Andrew Sewell in the US, who has been
Mm-hmm.
using
Yes.
high dose niacin for depression and
Yep.
schizophrenia for a very long time. But also, too, I'm also completing a qualification in nutritional psychiatry, just really backed on the fact that, I love Dr. Georgia Eads' work and Dr. Chris Palmer, who are psychiatrists, but also realize the power of, low carb to zero carb and getting the brain into ketosis. We have to get to the root cause. We just can't talk to the symptomatic process. So I've, 16 years ago, Ron, when I was asking people when they were coming to me, and, two main questions I asked them is, do you understand how your mind works? And please tell me what you eat. So 16 years
Mm-hmm.
ago, I was looked at like, what? So I was
Mm-hmm.
kind of a bit of a lonely ship floating in that kind of arena, because it was very, very unusual to be asked that, right? And people still don't get asked that.
Mm-hmm. No. When mental health problems are occurring, and we've done quite a few programs on this about the prescription, the first port of call is often, you're depressed. I wonder what kind of antidepressant I need to give you. Oh, you're anxious too, an anti-anxiety with tablet. Yes, this is the model, but there is obviously so much more we can do. Okay, well, tell us how you would approach how you approach it with the patient now. What's your modus operandi?
Yeah. So I get a lot of referrals, just basically from people that I work with who have really been in therapy for a long time and really, really struggling. So a lot of people will come to me with external symptoms. So what I call things like anxiety and depression, really lethargic, metabolic illness, relationship issues, really not liking who they are. So what I do is when I hear those things, they literally are a symptom of a deep root cause issue, which is linked back to two things: self-image conflict coming from a
Mm-hmm.
very poor programming in relation to our how we view ourselves both consciously and unconsciously, and also that root cause of metabolic health, which goes back to the gut. And it's really empowering people, Ron, to understand, like, do you actually think about what your body needs from you every single
Mm.
day? What amino acids do you understand that, if you talk about serotonin for a second, most people believe that, all the serotonin production is done in your brain. It actually isn't. It's 97% of it is actually in your gut. So, there's a whole process and chemical structures that our bodies need from food to convert those neurotransmitters, because your brain needs the amino acids to work. But where do we get them from? So a lot of people aren't allowed the empowerment to understand, well, tell me what you eat every day, and we can go through and understand that you're literally living on sugar and hyper processed foods. So how do you think your body's going to pull nutrients from that? So for me, I've always come from a space of education and really allowing people to understand two things. You're not broken, there's nothing wrong with you, but you've just not allowed yourself the permission to go, you know what? I need to understand those two root causes. Because from an unconscious point, in our precognitive commitment, which is between 0 to 7, as a child, we don't have the analytical ability to filter out anything. So everything, auditory, visual, physical, taste, smell, everything we learn as subset programs directed by our self-image, which we learn from other people in authority to us. Now, let's hope that sometimes that's a bit positive, but a lot of the time it's quite poor and very conflicted around external validation, how people think about us, what we feel about ourselves. But again, you cannot talk to a starving brain. You cannot, it's impossible to actually get the full piece of the puzzle unless you're treating your body in a calm state with calm food, understanding that you are a human being that needs fat and protein to actually survive and thrive.
Well, we're going to come back and talk about self-image because I think it's obviously important,
It
but
is.
what do we mean by it? How does it get influenced? And all that. But let's focus on the gut things and just to speak about what goes wrong. I think it's reasonably obvious in this modern world, but where do we draw the line and where do we start rebuilding? How do you do that with your clients?
So again, it's really understanding what their belief structures are and where they've learnt them around food. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, given the authority that doctors have, and we all know that doctors aren't trained in nutrition, they maybe have 6 hours over 4 or 5 years. So again, it's about retraining and unlearning. Okay, so where did I learn that it was okay to eat cereal that was literally has 50 grams of sugar in it in the morning? What is a rainbow diet? What is everything in moderation? That does not work. So it's a matter of understanding we are a human species. Okay. So as a species, we should be eating a species appropriate diet. Now, if you're shopping in the middle aisles of a supermarket, you're undernourished and overfed. So every single thing that you put in your trolley, it generally has 5,000 ingredients and they're not great. And we need to understand that the primal source of a human being is we are protein. That's what we are. And fat, because our brains are made of fat. So if we think about the whole dogma, in the 1970s, when we basically said, oh, everything's low fat and we need to remove meat and all that saturated fat propaganda, type 2 diabetes went through the roof, mental illness is going through the roof. Everything is just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So for me, it's about just tapping into each individual person's belief structure and the attachment to food and the attachment to comfort through food. So again, that comes back to connected to self-image of why we're eating our emotions and literally understanding that cereal is not a food. So most people start their day with cereal, which is just shocking.
Well, it's interesting to say people have faith in their doctor and where would their doctor get their information from. And I think it's fair to say most doctors, many schools, many institutions get their information from the Australian Healthy Eating Guidelines.
Correct, which is absolute disastrous. Because again, if you look at the star rating on foods, if you look at something like a coconut oil or unrefined coconut oil, that'll have a 1-star rating. But, something like Wheat Bix will have 5. And it's like,
Yeah, well, Weet-Bix are made by sanitariums, so they help make the star rating. So but it's an interest. I mean, you and I are aware of that, but it's a story that is very easy to miss as a health professional, as an institution. You would just assume that if it's an Australian government, NHMRC, Australian Healthy Eating Guideline, then it would be exactly what it says it is. So
correct.
this is part of the problem, isn't it?
It is part of the problem. So we've also got to go back to, we always say follow the money, right? Especially when it comes to vilifying, meat. And meat has been around for over 4 million years. It's a part of many, many cultures and tribes. And, if you look at the tribal nature of most heavy-based animal protein, they don't have type 2 diabetes. They don't have all the, 70% of cancers that come from, lifestyle choices and, type 2 diabetes. But this is also about making sure that people are scratching the surface and not just taking on board the propaganda, especially the plant-based propaganda around, even if we go back, it is deeply rooted to religious ideology through the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And then also we have Sanitarium on top of that. And Kellogg's literally own 86% of Beyond Meat. So you try to start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And doesn't take a rocket science really to understand, okay, so we've been told to take out meat, but we're getting sicker and sicker. And we're told to eat the, what I call the SAD diet, which is a standard Australian diet, which is literally full of inflammation-driven foods. And depression and anxiety are getting worse. And it's not just a physiological thing. It's not just a thinking thing, right? It's a gut-brain axis. We must feed our gut to get that serotonin and all those other dopamine and GABA and tyrosine and even tryptophan. So what I do for people, I get them to learn about their bodies. I get them to understand what they need. So like I did a post yesterday talking about most people know how their cars work and how their cars function better and what they need to do in their own bodies. So it is a belief structure, Ron, where we've really got to look at it going, well, is that serving you both mentally and physically? And let's look at that and let's kind of, really unravel that so that people can serve themselves in the best way.
You mentioned there are essential proteins, there are essential fats, there aren't essential carbohydrates, which I think in and of itself is an important one. And we often hear about carbohydrates being too high or too low. What is your view on that?
100%. So humans don't need carbohydrates. It's not an essential requirement, which is funny, like the event that we met at last week with, Dr. James Mukey and talking about diabetes. And I did say to him, like, it's so bizarre to me that carbohydrates aren't essential. We can operate in a fat-adapted state from a ketones because ketones are basically the best option for your brain versus glucose. Why is the messaging around the fact that if you've got type 2 diabetes, you've got to have carbohydrates? It's just so bizarre to me. But I do also understand people's connection to food and it is a comfort. So we've got to treat that really gently. But secondly, fat and protein is what humans need to thrive. So I always say to people, especially coming off a SAD diet and looking at their mental health protocol, and a lot of people have also used diets and foods as punishment to lose weight, and wrong end of the stick. We've got to turn it around and focus on, let's get your mental and physical health right and nourish yourself with good proteins. And the most powerful eating that you can choose is an animal-based way of life. Now, some people can have small amount of carbs, but again, Ron, it's uniquely propositioned to each person. So we've got to really take that into consideration. But again, the fear of actually saying to people, no, you don't need carbs. Like, I haven't eaten carbs for over 2 years and I'm not dead. And I haven't eaten a plant for over 2 years and I'm not dead.
Okay. So, well, now you're actually introduced another approach to diet, which is a carnivore diet, which is obviously where you are at the moment, or have been for some time.
Correct. So so over 2 years now, and literally it was a choice from, getting myself into insulin resistance from a bodybuilding background, right? So having protein and carbs, but carbs and fat and not the right ones, right? So I also had to unlearn, and that's a part of being an open human, where my training, 16 years ago was always, yes, protein, but carbs. And you've got to kind of unlearn and understand, and especially going through nutritional psychiatry training, we don't need carbs. We need fat and protein. So for me, I looked at my own situation and went, right, I'm just going to go full animal-based protein, reverse my insulin resistance. And I was going to do it for a couple of months. And that was 2.5 years ago. So again, it's looking at people in the state to go, you know what, where are you in your threshold? So a lot of people will say to me, I'm done. I need to control my anxiety or my depression and also get my self-image back into self-respect for myself. So good eating and understand eating is a level of self-value and self-love, which most human beings don't have. They have to learn that.
But your
Yeah.
carnivore diet wouldn't be where you would. I mean, I think it's an interesting one because it's an extreme. I think it's fair to say it's an extreme of the spectrum. Whereas the healthy
Well,
eating,
again, you've got to look at. Sorry, yeah,
so I
go.
was going to say, if I consider the healthy eating guidelines or the food pyramid as one extreme, and I do think that is an extreme, and I think if, as you've mentioned, if the evidence is anything to go by, which we're always told it is, you'd have to say that was a complete disaster. And then we move into, okay, where do we go? Well, we eat healthy fats and proteins, and we have low carb. And that means different things to different people, doesn't it? I
Correct.
mean, what does low? I
Yes, it
mean,
does.
you're on a carnivore diet, so I'm asking you, what does low carb mean to you? What does it? I mean, you incorporate some fruit into that, don't you?
I haven't eaten fruit for over 5 years.
Okay. So for you, it's zero carb.
Zero carb. So I've been zero carb, for the whole that time.
Wow.
And obviously there's a transition, right? So
Yeah.
again, any long-term carnivore, you speak to them and they'll tell you the same thing. It's like, I'm fine. My bloods are fine. I operate at a really high level because we operate on ketones, right?
Yeah.
So again, the flexibility is for me, if I was to add, so I haven't also eaten gluten or wheat for many, many years, right? Because I
Yeah.
understand the power of that on your gut and it's not good. But secondly, for me, it's like, what am I eating to fuel myself, to make myself feel both mentally and physically? And this is the most powerful way of eating for me. And also working with clients who have had disordered eating, and even some vegans who are very, very ill, we've transitioned back slowly into a low carb, which for them, I don't get people to measure things. We don't weigh things because, if you look at a tribal, for example, Eskimos or the Inuits, they just eat when they're hungry. They eat when they're not. You eat till you're satiated. But again, fat is a fuel, right? So we're so disconnected between what do we actually need to thrive versus going, well, if I don't have a piece of bread, am I going to feel discomfort in that? So there is a lot of areas around that self-image connection. But clients who do low carb for me, we kind of work out if there's gut reactions. So we go protein, fat first as a priority. Okay. So protein is a very calming, relaxed response because if you think about a piece of meat, and this is amazing to me, and nature never makes mistakes, right? So red meat holds 9 essential amino acids in the perfect form, right? That humans need from their diet. So we have 20 that we need to get, but the 9 our bodies can't make. So we actually need them from our food. Now we look at bioavailability, and with protein, because you also don't have a glucose reaction, or sorry, an insulin reaction, it keeps people very stable. We're not hunting or seeking for, oh my gosh, I need sugar, I need sugar, I need sugar. So for me, it's getting them to a level of calmness so they can be very clear. We can do that, self-image work with them. So the body and the mind are in alignment. We're not separating just this bit over here and then the guts over here, right? We're aligning them. So some people will have, prioritized protein. They'll have some lettuce, cucumber, whatever feels good for them. So I also get them to check in. Food is a messenger response. So if you eat a piece of bread and you want to go to sleep in 45 minutes, or you feel depressed for a couple of days, that's an issue. Food is meant to give you energy, not meant to send you to sleep. So for me, I always will prioritize the fact that I know what nutrients I get from animal-based way of eating. And for plants, for me, if we think back culturally, Ron, with our grandparents' generation, vegetables were very, very different. They were grown in soil that has the right zinc, all the right magnesium, all the things that, vegetables should be grown in. That's not the case these days, and by the time they're cut and they get to the supermarket, like I rarely go to obviously the fruit or vegetable aisle, but I'll come sometimes touch things and they're soft and I'm like, what? There's nothing in that that is going to actually help you because they are depleted. They're not the same.
They're not nutrient dense. They look good. They look okay, but
Correct.
yes, no, we've talked about that before, and I think that's an important one. And just to remind our listener, we're talking about fuel. The glucose is what everyone tells you you need. You need glucose for your fuel,
Sure.
but there's another fuel form, which is ketones, which you must be in ketosis all the time, are you?
Pretty much all the
Pretty much all the
time. Yeah.
time.
So I've been fat adapted for a long time. And I will say though that coming from a bodybuilding background and using, carbohydrates as that glucose fuel, it took me about 4 months for my body to adjust. But one of the biggest things is when you are in a ketosis state and you do train, you can train really, really hard and you do not get sore.
Hmm.
You literally feel like you haven't trained. So it's actually the fat versus the glucose, which again, glucose is causing inflammation, right?
Hmm.
So it's also about choice of fuel. And every client that I've worked with that has, been on diets all their life, or they've had really anxiety issues. So starting to reduce the glucose reaction in the carbohydrates. So I'm talking, things like rice, white refined flour, sugars, even some vegetables, right? Potatoes are very high in carb reaction. So it's literally about that insulin response. The minute they start to get that down, the first thing they say to me is like, oh, I cannot believe how clear I am. And I actually have so much energy. I actually don't know what to do.
Hmm.
So I know that they're feeling that ketosis shift. So their brain is starting to run on ketones, which is so, so powerful. And that's why, I'm such an advocate for people really learning, what am I doing to myself? What am I fueling myself with? But also, too, we do have a negative self-image there as well that we have to align with. Um, and yeah, I think it's one of the most powerful forms of eating that a human can gift themselves.
And I think it bears me also mentioning that not all meat is the same, is it? I mean, the
No,
type of meat that we
it's not.
choose is quite important. How do you make that decision?
So I'm very much aware of where my meat comes from. So it's regenerative farming and, grass fed versus grain fed. Now, obviously, it also depends on people's budgets. But for me, coming from a mental health space, I will always say to someone, if all you can get is grain fed, you need to get that because it's still got the aminos in it, right? But the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 will be quite different. Okay. So red meat, grass fed, got your omega-3s in there. And also vitamin C. This is the other thing too, when people kind of go, oh, if you don't eat vegetables, you're going to get scurvy if you eat. I'm like, no, we're all good. I know people who've been carnivore for 20, 30 years. No scurvy. We're all good. So again, it's busting those myths, right? So what we've got to do is go, well, where did that come from? So let's just scratch the surface and see where that kind of myth came from. And normally we feed it back to either Mr. Kellogg's Sanitarium or the plant-based propaganda, right? Now, it is also around the fact that we've been told that fat is going to make you fat and, that it's going to contribute to heart disease and all these things. And as we know, back in the 1950s, early 60s, there was 3 Harvard professors that were paid off to basically say that saturated fat was bad and sugar was okay. So this is why we're in the mess we're in, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the way healthcare in inverted commas works globally. So you know,
Yeah,
that is again another one of those stories that is easy to miss, but once you hear it, difficult to ignore. But yeah, absolutely.
correct. Yeah. And also just going back to what you were talking about with, making sure that you know where your meat comes from and being very aware. So any carnivore you speak to, or even a low carb person that prioritizes protein, they're very welfare driven, right? So they do look for where their meat comes and they understand the practices. Whereas the other side of it too, there's no such thing as a bloodless diet. So if you're eating a high plant-based diet, death is still involved. And again, I think we've really got to understand the reality of, you know, where does that come from again? But lots of animals lose their life regardless of which way you eat. But it's all about going, well, where do I choose and what else can I do to actually help the planet? So for again, cows have been vilified for climate change, and it's just, again, scratch the surface because that's actually not correct. But let's look about the amount of plastics we can reduce that have phthalates in it, that cause endocrine disruption with your body. Tap water. Please don't drink tap water, everyone.
Yes, that's a theme.
Please stay away from
That's
that.
a theme we've explored on the program before as well, and I think we've accepted that getting clean water to our house is a good thing, but what we do with it once we turn the tap on is up to us. And in my own home, I'm
Correct.
doing reverse osmosis, water filter. But I think the other thing is when you look at plant-based, this whole push to plant-based, I actually think that vegans are unwittingly becoming foot soldiers for the processed food industry, holding a
Pretty
banner
much.
of environmental degradation in their hand to make them feel good. I was looking at the plant-based labels on the plant-based foods in the supermarkets.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Pretty horrific,
Talk
isn't it?
about ultra-processed foods.
Absolutely. And we wonder why when we eat them, people say to me, oh, I had that and I was bloated and I felt really bad. I'm like, yeah, because it's actually not food. It's food-like substance, right? But again, it is about money. It all comes back to the agenda of vilifying meat and removing one of the most powerful nutritional sources that humans need.
But if I was playing the devil's advocate, Natalie, and I said to you, how is carnivore diet a first world option? I mean, how sustainable globally is a carnivore diet? What would you say?
Again, it comes back to your own. So for me personally, my first reaction will be yes, 100%, right? Because again, we didn't have, so if we go back even back to tribal point, right? We are hunters. The first thing that we would need is meat. And if you even look at a lion, I use this kind of analogy quite often, right? So we're a species, a lion's a species. So you don't see a sick fat lion because they don't go off what they intuitively know they need to eat. Whereas humans and most species in the world don't make their own food. This is where we've run into problems. Humans make so much food that actually is not fit for human consumption.
Yeah, but we are omnivores, and that's part of our strength, isn't it? That we as a species are omnivores, not carnivores.
No, actually, apex predators we actually are carnivores. Because also too, if you look at the physiological part of our brain size, there was berries and things like that, but there was not a plethora of vegetables like we have today, right? So again, meat first, fat priority, then anything else in that. But what we've done, we've swung the other way. And if you look at Eskimos, what do you grow there? You can't grow anything there because it's so cold, and they survive on penguin and blubber and meat, right? And I think they do have some berries that are naturally for that region. But it's one of those things, Ron, where we get so in cognitive dissonance of understanding, like, how can you survive like that? But again, it's like, well, I feel this way. My mental health is reversed. My metabolic health is reversed. People reverse their type 2 diabetes, removing carbs and eating high protein. But again, the sustainability comes from the fact when I get people into how they can actually produce how they feel, it's very rare that they'll jump out of it, because if they do, they get the reaction. So I always teach people, listen to the feedback. But when you're eating a high processed sugar-based diet, you don't get feedback. All you get is chaotic thoughts, chaotic reactions in your body, inflammation, pain. So we've really stripped back to getting back to primal ancestral eating, then adding things back in that work for that person. But it's also about getting that food freedom back. And again, humans aren't meant to eat 8 times a day. Like, it just drives me mad when I see influencers going, oh, you got to have breakfast, got to have a snack, and then you got to have that to keep your metabolism up. That's just rubbish. It's not true.
Yeah. So you, in your carnivore approach, how does the day look for you? Give us a typical day. Yesterday, what did you eat yesterday?
So this morning it's pretty much the same, pretty much every day. So I'll have about 6 eggs, scrambled eggs in the morning with butter. Sometimes I might throw some Danish feta on it. It really just depends on how I feel. I'll have 1 coffee and I put myo-inositol in that, which is an amino acid powder, because coffee deletes inositol out of your body. Then I will not eat now, probably until, I don't know, 2, 3, 4. It just depends on when I get that signal. So the difference between eating a carnivore based or a high heavy base protein diet, you really understand the signals of true hunger and when your body's going, I need fuel now. And so I'll have maybe 2 chops, some ox heart, some steak. So I eat quite a lot. So I'll eat between maybe 500 grams to a kilo of meat a day. But, I'll eat until I'm satiated and then my brain just turns off. So if we look at those 2 fuel switch sources, so sugar turns on the brain to seek and hunt and keep you in that state of, I need that to kind of function, whereas fat turns it off. So it'll turn it on to give you fuel to eat. Once you eat till you're satiated, you just stop. And you can't actually force any more food in. So with carbohydrates, you just keep going and the signal doesn't register. So then, an hour later, you want to have a kind of siesta at 2:00 in the afternoon and you kind of wonder why. So that's pretty much it for me. And, I still weight train. Sometimes if I get back home after training and I'm like, I'll really listen to my intuition of what I want and maybe I'll have some sardines and that's about it. So it's pretty much that every day. Same when I'm travel, no different.
And you, because you mentioned you have a child, or 1 or
2.
2, and how old are they?
Yeah. So my son is 16
Yep.
and my daughter is 12.
Right. And are they, what would you say to them? I mean, this is how mum's eating. Surely they rebel against that.
Well, you know what? They've seen me for many, many years make sure that I don't eat junk food,
Yeah,
and they have learned by watching me. My daughter is probably more heavy protein centric than my son. But, I'll sneak some liver into his meatballs when he doesn't know, just to make sure he gets the vitamins and minerals that he needs. But again, it's just about them understanding their signals. And I'm happy for them. My son's 16. So when he goes out with his mates, he may have some KFC that's full of seed oils, which again are very toxic. He'll come home and, he'll be in gut pain and he'll be in the toilet. And I'll like, well, mate, that's your option, right?
Told you so. Told you. Na.
Sorry, mum told you.
Yeah.
So again, for him, it's just going, yeah, okay, I get it. But my daughter is pretty much, she'll always choose protein first. And she'll have, some lettuce with some tzatziki and cucumber and cheese and So, and it's also good for her, especially girls coming into puberty, right? So also, again, PMS symptoms, bloating, all of those things that we are told are normal. They're not normal. And also cravings aren't normal either. They're a sign that your body is nutritionally deficient.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think we've also done some programs where we've outlined some of the dangers of vegetables. Like there are oxalates, phytates, salicylates, FODMAPs, lectins. Yeah. I mean, vegetables are pretty darn dangerous things to be eating.
They are. Well, it's funny. I'll take a little statement from an amazing colleague of mine, Dr. Chafee. He's like, plants are trying to kill you.
Well, they're trying to protect themselves. That's
correct. They're not meant to be eaten, right?
That's right. Now, listen, self-image is obviously a big part of your approach, and I think it should be a big part of everyone's approach in life. Talk to us about self-image. I mean, there's this saying about show me let's say the person, not boy, but show me the person at 7 and I'll show you the adult. Tell us about self-image. How you touched on it earlier. What influences it? How can we change it?
Yeah, so basically it's about understanding that precognitive phase between the age of 0 to 7. And if I get to everyone to think about their head as a video camera, so you are recording everything through your emotional context at that age, which literally is guided by those people in authority to you. So the first people that you see also is your parents. That's the first relationship that you view. So between 0 to 7, we cognitively absorb all of that. And from an unconscious point, which is where we operate in a waking state of hypnosis 90% of the day. So if I use the analogy of your breathing is unconscious, thank goodness, because if we had to think to breathe, we'd all be dead. So it operates in an unconscious phase. However, also does your belief structures, your value systems, and your unconscious self-image, which is developed and pretty much set by the time you are 7. So your view and your lens to the world about yourself has been given to you by your caregivers and your parents, which they are also programmed in the same way from your grandparents. So that's when you also hear family cycles of behaviors, right? Which again, I 100% believe and have actually worked in this space for a long time to understand that can be disrupted. That does not have to continue. Now, again, being in a waking state of hypnosis literally means that you are unconscious and running generally on that self-poor and conflicted self-image state. So what that means is if you get yourself and you look at yourself in the mirror, most people don't do that because they don't like what they see on the outside. However, consciously, what your mind is also designed to do is to protect you at all costs, whether or not it serves you or not. So if you think about emotional content, that's what you learn in a reactive state to either be in a fight or flight response or not. So when I get people to understand what their self-image is, I take them through a process that actually allows them to go back to the root cause, which actually shows them what is running their behavior every day. Now, consciously, what you think your self-image looks like is not what your unconscious is running on. Okay. Again, value systems. Most people don't even understand unconsciously what's driving their behavior. But what you hear is, I'm really intelligent, but I keep doing the same things over and over and over and again that I know aren't good for me. Why do I keep doing that? Well, the reason why you keep doing that is because you can talk about those things forever, but unless you bypass the analytical judgment part of your conscious and get into the unconscious programming of that 0 to 7, understand the value and the emotional content that has been anchored with, nothing will ever change. So again, relationship back to self. So self-image comes back to, we are taught to validate externally through love, relationships, food, exercise. If I look a certain way, then I'll be loved. So for, all of the work that I do around teaching people what their self-image is and how it's operating for them every single day is to get them back to a relationship with themselves, because that is one of the most important things that we need in our lives. Then that will also show up in a very different way externally. So I always say to people, if you've had a series of relationships and they're pretty much all the same, but they're not good for you, why is that? Is because the anchor of the relationship that you learnt between 0 to 7 is based on your parents. So
It's interesting, that this 0 to 7 period is so important. And hey, listen, I got to tell you, I've now got 5 grandchildren from the age of 2 days,
Wow.
2 days old.
Wow, congratulations.
Yes, thank you. 2 days old, 7 months old, 2 years old, 3 years old, 6 years old. So here we are, a snapshot of the first 7 years in one room sometimes. And it's so interesting because, I guess we are in a state at that age, particularly in the before 4 years old, of just total absorption of what is going on. And yet it's so important. How do we re-engage and observe a period in our lives where we may not have very strong memory or any memory at all?
Well, yeah, this is the thing, right? So when we talk about CBT therapy, that's a story mode that we can continue. And, that's why I always say to people, the work that I do will be like, we're not going to go talk about the stories. I'm not going to ask you what happened at 2 because who's going to remember that, right? Or I'm not even going to ask you what happened at 17 because it's actually irrelevant. What is relevant is by passing the story, getting to the program that drives the value of the behavior and that self-image. So most people will have a two neural pathway, right, between positive self-image, which rarely shows up. It'll kind of try to creep its head out, like when you got to do something new and you're like, I can do this. And you're like, yeah. And one part of you is going, yep, yep, yep. But then the other neural pathway that you've developed in a very negative emotional content will always override it.
Mhm.
So it's about understanding how we condition ourselves every single day. Thoughts become things which then become energy. So again, negative energy has a high emotional content. Now you would normally think, well, I know that's not good for me, but why do I keep going down that path? Because your mind loves familiarity. It doesn't want you out of unfamiliarity. It's designed to protect you. Even in that familiarity, it may be harming you, but that's the neural pathway that you'll develop based on a negative self-image because it feels comfortable. Consciously, you know you want to change it. So again, if we use a baby analogy, right? The baby goes to walk, gets up, falls down. The baby doesn't go, I'm not walking anymore. It just keeps developing the neural pathway. As an adult, it's no different. But to shift from a very strong negative and poor and conflicted self-image about oneself, which is generally always based on other people's thoughts, feelings, and reactions, and then that also runs your life. And that's also too, it's a cultural tribe thing, especially around food. You know, if you're kind of wanting to heal yourself and then all of a sudden someone says, oh, have a piece of cake, it's not going to kill you. It's about making sure that your self-image is really powerful, that you know, no, this is what works for me. So when you start to shift from that, the energy that comes with building that new positive neural pathway is really small. So people are going to go, oh, that didn't work, because you don't have the enough emotional content that you've built. So it's about creating a gap in the space between conscious and unconscious, and also getting people into consciousness, because most people will operate in the past or the future. They're never, ever conscious. And I always say to people, you will never, ever build anything in the future unless you learn to be conscious and be centered and be still and understand how this thing works and how you can fuel it. So with children, it's literally about making sure. So you could have like siblings all in one house. Now, there could be a series of events, right? But every single person is going to process that differently. They're going to hear it differently and they're going to feel it differently. So that's why there's a lot of arguments sometimes in families where they're like, that didn't happen that way. Yes, it was. I was there. And it's like, well, no one's right or wrong. It's just also the level of emotional content that that child has developed in the reaction. So with kids, it's just all about making sure, like I'm always an advocate, don't have the TV on. Have some really beautiful music on in the background. Don't have commercial radio, because they're absorbing everything. And also too, you know, if there's a little bit of a disagreement that you're having, it's always good to kind of remove yourself from, you know, kids that can see that, because they can't analytically filter out that what's going on. Like they look angry, or they feel the energy.
I guess the other big challenge in terms of dealing with self-image, particularly in our modern world, is the bombardment of alternate images or aspirational images. This is what you should or could be like. I mean, that must be a huge factor that you're dealing with. How do you?
I am.
What advice do you give to clients who are being? We're all bombarded by that.
We are. And it comes back to also, again, where does that come from in relation to external validation? So, you know, Instagram is probably one of the worst, but also too, it's educating the person on understanding what dopamine reaction that's having. So, you know, most of our children and even adults, we're living in a very dopamine externally dominant life. So then also too, internally with hyper processed foods and sugars, we're also living an internally dopamine dominant life. So our dopamine is just firing all day. And that's why a lot of people are then can't have the ability to actually just sit and do nothing, because their brain is like next. And in relation to visualization, especially with women, when we're looking at, you know, Instagram and what you should look like, this also just comes back to understanding where the root cause of that comes from. Like, why do you want to change yourself? And the client comes into my head yesterday. I spoke to, like, her mum was a big dieter and had said to her, if you eat that, no boy is ever going to date you.
Right,
Wow.
right.
So,
Talk about external
she ended up with an
validation.
eating disorder. Correct. So that simple statement has literally ran her unconscious most of her life. So again, it's about putting in spaces and gaps to get people into consciousness. So we're calming down that dopamine filter effectively and really allowing people to choose, right? So I'm like, well, if you choose that, be aware what the outcome will be for you. But when you are operating either on a very high flight or flight response or a very negative self-image, we've got to kind of lower that first, shift that, get their self-respect up, their self-value. And also too, Ron, as a child, we're not taught how to love ourselves unconditionally. We are conditionally loved most of the time. It's like, well, if you do that, you'll get this. If you be a good boy or a good girl, you'll get this. So again, food is also used very early on as treats, like a reward system. Bad. Don't use food or treats or chocolate as a reward, because that's very, very slippery slope for people.
So listen, if we were going to leave our listener with, here are some ideas. Okay, we've established self-image is important. We've established it's challenging and being challenged all the time. What are 3 or 4 hints or tips that you would give a person to improve their self-image?
So what I'd love people to kind of think about is really the power of their mind and their brain and how we condition it without being really aware. So one thing I'd love people to kind of start tuning into is when you go into bed, when you lie down, I want you to think about what thoughts, feelings, and reactions is going on in your mind and your body. Pay really good attention to the fact where you are. Now, most of the time, people will go to sleep in the past, which is literally from the day earlier or the day before or the week before, and they're negative and they've had a bad argument or something happened with a customer. You're actually not conscious. You're actually programming yourself to stay in the past, okay? Because guess what? It's familiar. Even though it's not great. So you'll go to bed in a cortisol raised response because you'll be stressed, you won't sleep well. Then you wake up in the morning, and I want people to think about the first thought that they had. Where are they? Is it still attached to the thing that they were looking at the night before? Or again, are they then anxious about, what's going to happen today? What I'd love people to do in between those gaps is say the words "and now." What that does, it brings you back into direct consciousness. So when people mind starts wandering away and they start negative talking and they start beating themselves up, you are either in the past or the future. Okay? You oscillate between the two. What I'd love people to do is to be able to redirect themselves back to consciousness and say "and now." Now, even when you say that, you can't go anywhere. It's literally like a blank slate. So what we're doing is creating a gap and a space in between where you've been to where you need to be. So clients will use it all day, every day, because it's retraining that neural pathway to, instead of staying on the same track and the same data that we're so used to, that even though it's not good for us, it allows us to redirect back to consciousness. It's very powerful. It sounds very simple. But again, the other amazing little tool that people can do is use that also in stillness. So, if you're sitting still for a minute or two, it's probably going to sound quite easy, but it's actually not when you do it, because people automatically will go, I can't sit still, because we can't sit with ourselves, right? Because we're so consumed by what's going on. So if you sit in stillness, just breathe. It's just concentrating on your breath in consciousness until then your brain or your body kicks in and tries to either move you or you start to get attached to the thoughts. It's about disconnecting from the thoughts and pushing them outside your head. It's like you're watching them. It's like waves. You're just watching them. We don't need to grab onto them. We just need to watch them. Now, if we get lost in that, we then again say, "and now." Bring back to direction, breathe, and do that process until you get to the point where you can sit there for 10 or 15 minutes blank. So that's a really good process for people to start becoming very conscious and being present. Because you cannot build anything or change anything unless you understand the consciousness.
Hmm. Hmm.
Mm.
Yes, well, the power of the brain and being present. It's interesting because what we've covered here today is, the two brains, and we've dealt with the
Mm.
first brain first, which I think is a
Yeah.
really powerful and strong message, and alerting us to still the importance of the second brain, and it needs attention.
Yeah.
Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing that
Thanks,
with
Ron.
us. And it's raised so many issues there that we've covered in various forms on this podcast. But this has tied it together really nicely with mental health and so many of the challenges. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And I just really want to just leave one
Yeah.
more thing with people is to understand, you know, mental health and physical health are all contributed to our first brain. So don't discount the fact that if you aren't aware of it, you've not been told that, start exploring it for yourself because it's very, very powerful.
That is such an important message to end on. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you.
I often find it interesting. Obviously, self-image is an important part of all of our lives, and interesting that those 0 to 7 years are so critical in forming that self-image, and yet those years are often years that we have very little memory of. And the impact of our early years on our lives is not an easy thing to reflect on, but it's obviously an important one, and then but also having the resilience to do that kind of critical reflection with some strength, and that's why how well you sleep is obviously a very big part of that. If you do not have the physical or mental energy to reflect in an objective way and feel strong about what you may find, it's very difficult if you're not sleeping well. But it's often said you are what you eat, and the impact of nutrition on our mental health is profound. I mean, as Natalie correctly said, the gut is the first brain, and this was the observation that Dr. Pran Yoganathan made, who's an integrative gastroenterologist who we interviewed some time ago, a few months ago, last year. And when I asked him, is the gut the second brain? He begged to differ and said, no, it's actually the first brain. And he went on to explain why that is so. And I agreed with him, and I agreed with Natalie in her assessment of this. And when we were looking at other episodes, like with Professor Julia Ruckledge about the better brain and the importance of nutrients in that, it seems like we again are coming back to a very holistic view of how to take control of our health and be the best we can be. And things don't have to be complicated. They don't have to even be expensive. I mean, sleep is one of the cheapest things you do, and yet it has the most profound impact on you. Well, what you put in your mouth is also critically important, and a worthwhile investment. If we are, as is true, what we eat, then it makes sense to take care about what that is. Anyway, we will have links to Natalie's site and her other site that she is engaged with, which is tacklingthesilence.com. This is something we didn't actually touch on. We will come back and revisit, but that is an initiative that she has undertaken with a colleague, with a friend who I'm also familiar with. So we will have links, of course, to Natalie's site, and might even have links to Paul Saladino's book on the Carnivore Diet, because I think it's a really excellent book, and I'm going to try and get Dr. Paul Saladino onto the program to discuss the carnivore diet in much more detail. Anyway, I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. For content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.